My name's Joy Castro, and I'm going to read to you from One Brilliant Flame. First, I want to thank Nancy. Those great remarks. I'm definitely going to be taking Florida seriously today. And many thanks to Katrin and to Arlo and to all the students who were in my workshop this week. Fantastic. And to everyone who came out today. And to the volunteers who approached me when I got here and said that your book club is reading One Brilliant Flame. Thank you. What a warm welcome. You all are a beautiful view. So I never really thought of myself as a Florida writer, even though I was born in Miami and we lived in Opelika and Kendall, and even though my family had been in Florida for 5 generations, 4 of them here in Key West. I didn't really think of myself as a Florida writer because we moved away from Miami when I was 7. Hello? And because my first 6 books were primarily about other places, the places that had marked me as an individual, like West Virginia and Texas and New Orleans. So my books were set in those other places. Though we came to Key West every year to stay with my grandparents on Elizabeth Street, I didn't think there was really a story there. They were just our grandparents, right? And our cousins were there, and we all had a great time and fished off the docks and swam. And then we would go home to our lives. And then in 2002, my father died by suicide, and among his effects, we found 2 manuscripts, 2 typescripts that had been printed here in Key West. One was by my great-grandfather, Juan Perez Rollo, who came here in 1869 from Cuba to Key West, from Cuba in 1869, at the beginning of the 10 Years' War, the anti-imperial war, the anti-colonial revolutionary war against Spain, which had started in 1868 with the Grito de Yara. The other manuscript, and that first one was a prose account, an eyewitness account of his entire growing up years here in Key West. And the other manuscript was a book of poetry that my grandfather had written, and he had come here as a 24-year-old man when his steamship stopped in Key West on the way from Tampa back to Havana, which was his home. He stopped here, he went to a restaurant, he heard that a cigar factory needed a lector, a loud reader, and he applied for the job, got it, and stayed, and he spent the rest of his life here. He became a newspaper man and editor working with Juan Perez Rollo, and they worked together on the newspaper Florida, a weekly Spanish newspaper, for many years. And then he founded a press on Elizabeth Street, at 311 Elizabeth Street, Florida Press, and continued to do printing work until I was a child. So a fascinating history. And so when I started to read these texts, translate them from the Spanish, which I needed a lot of help with, as a 5th-generation Floridian, I had mostly lost the Spanish that my parents' generation was fluent in. But they had, here in schools in Key West, been, beaten if they used Spanish by the teachers. And then when my father moved to Miami as a young man before 1959, he also suffered police brutality because of his difference as a Cuban American. So they didn't want us to learn Spanish. So I didn't learn it, my brother didn't learn it, our cousins didn't learn it. This is a different story around language and heritage. So anyway, it took a while to translate those texts. And in 2019, I had the opportunity to go to an NEH seminar at the University of Tampa. It was super niche. It was all about the 19th century tobacco towns in Florida, the Cuban tobacco towns. So Tampa and Key West primarily. And the whole tradition of the cigar factory where the workers would roll cigars all day. A good cigar roller could do 100 a day, while listening to the lector, the loud reader. And this is a tradition that most people don't know about today. I didn't know about it. I didn't know that my grandfather was one until I started doing this research in the last 6 years. So they would read in the mornings the news of the day. So they would read the newspapers aloud to the workers. And then they would read political theory, including Marx and Engels and Proudhon and Bakunin. So communism and anarchism in the factories. And so this went on throughout the Caribbean, but definitely here in Key West for decades. And Key West was a center for the Cuban emigres who would raise funds and munitions for the Cuban anti-colonial fight back in Cuba, so the fight against Spain. So it was quite extraordinary, and Jose Marti visited here, as some of you know, and he actually was reported to have found the Key West community of Cubans even more radical than the ones that he had known in New York, so that they actually pushed his perspective. And something that most people don't know, that I didn't know, that my family didn't know, like my generation of the family didn't know, is that there was this anti-colonial, anti-racist, pro-labor moment, a utopian dream that was here in Key West for over 30 years. So people of different races were working next to each other in the cigar factories, rolling those cigars, hearing the news in the morning, the political theory read aloud, and then in the afternoons, beautifully enough, the lectores would read novels. So one of the favorite novels of the cigar rollers was The Count of Monte Cristo, so an adventurous novel. Another one was Les Miserables, so the great humanist novel by Victor Hugo. So the workers were getting, and I think this is really important and key and connects to what Karen was saying about erased portions of our history and education. The workers were getting a university-level education, auditorily, every day, while they performed manual labor that fueled the economic engine of Key West. So I was totally fascinated when I learned all this stuff in that month-long seminar in Tampa. Deep dive, riveting material that I had not known before, even though it was my own family's history. There were so many ruptures and so much trauma in my family that wasn't a story that they passed on. My grandfather, the one who'd been a lector at El Gato cigar factory here in town, he was 75 by the time I was born. Right? So by the time I was 10, he was a very old man, and he only spoke Spanish, and my generation only spoke English. So it was a lost history. And if those typescripts had not been there among my father's things, I don't think I ever would have pursued this mystery. And when I found out that there had been a fire in Key West, the Great Fire of 1886, which burned the city to the ground. And it was at that time, I think, the most prosperous city in all of Florida because of the cigar industry. Pardon? Thank you. It was, did you say it was the most prosperous? Oh, and the shipwrecks, yeah, right. That preceded the cigar industry. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely, but super prosperous. And it burned to the ground. The city hall burned, 18 cigar factories burned, over 600 private homes burned, and arson was suspected at the time for two reasons. One, because Key West was functioning as that rebel base, basically, a rebel base for the insurgency back in Cuba. So the Spaniards would send people here to like fight duels, assassinate. There had been other arson attempts already, right? So arson was suspected for that reason, and then also for labor reasons. Because the labor market was in a way constricted despite the steamships that ran regularly, there was a labor pool that had a lot of power. So they would go on strike, right? They were getting marks read to them every day. They would go on strike, they would support their own, and they would force the factory owners to capitulate to their terms. And the lectores, I should note, were actually hired, paid, and fired by the workers. Yeah, not by the factory owners. So they were not reading like palliatives to the workers to keep them pacified, right? So the workers chose what they wanted to hear. Okay, so that's the broader context. I've been very, very excited to do this recovery work that's so important to my family, that has changed things for us, for our children, for my cousins, for my aunts who are still living. And I thought, well, since I know about that fire, what if I use my skills as a writer of literary thrillers to bring this to life in a way that's a page-turner, a kind of whodunit. And so that's what I did. And my book has 6 narrators who are main characters, 3 young women and 3 young men, all of whom occupy different positions, racial, socioeconomic, different kinds of career ambitions and erotic desires. So they sort of span the spectrum, and I'm just going to read you 3 super brief chapters narrated by 3 different young women. So the 3 young men are really cool too. One is a lector, one is a cafetero, the guy who went from row to row serving everybody coffee as they worked. And then another one is a guerrilla soldier from Cuba. But I'll just read you the 3 young women. Yeah. And I should say that the University Press of Florida is going to bring out our bilingual edition of my grandfather's poems this October. Yeah, with a critical introduction and everything. So we're doing, a socio-political intervention in how we think about Florida's literary history and Key West's in particular. So the first chapter I'll read is narrated by the character Zenaida, and the publisher let me put little icons for each character, and Zenaida's icon is a quill pen. Oh, wow, it's so nice and bright, I can actually see without my little glasses. Awesome. Outside the tall windows of the galera, I stood with my mother and other women who were free from work in the afternoon and who arrived at the factory to gather in clusters. Our parasols jostling, and listened to the latest installment of the Russian novel the new lector had brought. Ostensibly, I too was there to listen, to better myself, as my mother said, to get an education. But, as always, I stood where I could watch Chaveta. Nimble, swift, and slim, her fingers flickered as she twisted the tobacco into a tube, wrapped it, and slicked it down with resin. Her hand on the knife trimmed the ends with a certainty I envied, the way my mother chopped an onion or the head from a hen, utterly free of hesitation, sure of purpose, as if doubt were unknown to her, as if she never wondered what to do. The new lector's voice described the vacillations of Anna Karenina, who seemed far more comprehensible to me, driven by desires, acting, then drawing back, anguished, judging herself, trying a different path, stumbling. She felt more real than the people I knew in my own life, who never seemed to question what they did, all so committed, so passionate, so sure, whether wresting Cuba from Spain's grasp, or marching in a strike, or making fistfuls of American dollars. They all seemed to know what and whom they wanted, while I watched and longed and wondered, unsure of what was right, unsure of what to do. And so I did nothing. I obeyed my mother, observed, listened, played it safe. Though Maceo had arrived on the steamer from Havana, he had not yet come to our boarding house, which was strange. Chaveta said he was staying a few nights with the Bozas first. He had come to rally troops, Chaveta said, to raise funds, to inform us of the progress in the field, and to wait for secret instructions from the Cubans in New York. He didn't yet know how those instructions would arrive, and he was seeking a way to smuggle them back to the guerrilla fighters, a way that could not be detected if the Spaniards captured him. Bent over her workbench, Chaveta blew a dark strand of hair from her face. Her cheeks were flushed with the heat of the galera. Outside, a breeze cooled us, but still it was hot. The full feeling from the good food at lunch made me drowsy. The handsome new lector read on, but my mind drifted from the story of Oblonsky and Levin and Anna and their lusts and woes as Chaveta's hands twirled and spun the brown leaves into objects men would kiss to life and suck and burn, her head bowed over her work, a quick smile flashing on her face from time to time when some line from the lector pleased her. Girl. A deep voice above and behind my shoulder. I turned. His eyes were dark and steady, and he wore a soldier's garb, mended, clean, a rebel fighter's clothes, the color of forests. He smelled of leather, soap, and horses. Hot flutters beat my belly. Maceo. Drink coffee with me, he said. His voice stayed low, but still the other women glanced, cutting their eyes at each other. My mother's face was very still, but for a tiny twitching at the corner of her mouth. No, I said, I'm listening to this. You're listening to fiction. His dismissive smile was faint. I'll tell you something real. My mother looked at me, her eyebrows arching so high they nearly hit her blue head wrap. Leave me alone, I said, I'm busy. I'll call on you this evening. I shrugged. Do what you like. His breath stroked the nape of my neck, and my hairs quivered, electric. Always, he said. Without turning to stare, I knew everything about Maceo by heart. His skin, smooth and fine and easy to covet, like polished teak, touchable, sleek. It sloped up over his cheekbones, which my fingertips hungered to trace. In comparison, I felt my own ugliness, all my features just slightly shy of perfect harmony, just close enough to beauty to fool others, but madden me when I prodded them with my fingers in the looking glass. I had studied him for hours while he slept in the sickbed at my mother's boarding house, fevered from his bullet wound. I stood stock still, letting the moments pass, staring hard at the lector on his high platform to keep from swaying. As if he could feel my gaze, the lector read a sentence directly to me, his eyes on mine, but the sense of it did not penetrate my mind. Chaveta pounded her knife on the table in approval, and other rollers followed her lead. A thunder of metal on wood filled the air, deeper and stronger than the applause of clapped hands. When it faded, I felt cool emptiness behind me where Maceo's body had been, and the air no longer bore his scent. I glanced back to confirm the truth. He was gone. My mother's elbow nudged my ribs. Mama, stop, I said. It's nothing. She laughed. So that's an introduction to Zenaida. Thank you. And now I'll read a chapter from the point of view of her best friend, Chaveta. And Chaveta wears men's trousers, works in the cigar factory, and her little icon is a cigar. A wooden rectangle with 5 rectangles inside. That was our house in El Barrio de Gato, out on the far corner of Virginia and Duval, exactly like 1,000 other workers' houses here. If it were a cigar box and I opened the lid, you'd see the little parlor at the front with the wood stove we almost never needed to use. My mother was proud of the bright, flowered cotton curtains she'd sewn from sacks. They hung at all 3 windows. Then you'd see the bedroom for the 6 of us kids, our straw-stuffed pallets side by side on the floor, the walls papered with pages we picked from old newspapers, neatly glued, some yellowing, the recent ones still white, and you'd smell the warm, comfortable, animal smell of us all nestled in our blankets. In the evenings, sometimes I used those newspapers to teach the little ones to read, sounding out the words by lamplight. Then my parents' bedroom, the only room with a door, so they could keep making more of us, Papi said. And then the kitchen with its cook stove, where a folding screen in the corner let us bathe with privacy, though no peace. One naked child after another ran through the house, wet and shrieking, as my mother grumbled after them with our towel. The long, thin rectangle of the hallway ran along the south wall and ended at the back door, which led outside, where 5 wooden steps took us down to the water pump and the privy we shared with our neighbors. Papi had added a front porch, a luxury where we sat at night for the cool breezes. All the cigar workers had these little wooden box houses slapped up fast as business boomed, side by side, like tinder. Back when he drank less and was fun, my father used to call me my little hatue. I'd climb up barefoot on the table and swing his chaveta like a sword. "Death to Spaniards," I'd yell, leaping down. "Death to the lying dogs." My mother didn't care for my games or for the nickname my father had given me, the name of a warrior chief who fought the conquistadors and was burned at a stake. So that name died. Chaveta stuck. My father said I had Taino in me from his blood and Arawak from my mother's, that while the Spaniards claimed they had expunged all Indio blood from the island, that was a Spanish lie. Arawaks were fiercer, my father said, which is why it was so hard for him, a peace-loving man, to wrangle my mother like a wild horse. I laughed. "What do you know of horses?" "Exactly nothing," he rolled his eyes, "which is why it took me so long to tame your mother." No one would ever tame me. No one. And then lastly, I'll read you their other friend in the triangle of these 3 young women. And this is almost more of a frenemy. I was thinking about literature and how I hadn't read any genuine sadists, female sadists in literature, though there are plenty of male sadists in literature and film. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. And I kept asking all my literature professor friends, have you come across it? And no, like there are dominatrices, but they're enacting the masculine desire to be dominated, right? So, but someone who actually derives pleasure from causing pain. I thought, well, that would be interesting. So just in the interest of fair game, I thought, well, I'll try to create a believable female sadist character and write her from the inside. So Sophia, she's actually the daughter of the factory owner who owns the factory where Chaveta works, and he also owns plantations back in Cuba still. And you might know that in 1886, enslavement was still legal back in Cuba. Right? And so Sophia fetishizes a number of things, including racial and class difference. So she's an unreliable narrator. Okay. At dusk, I sat sewing on the veranda. The sprawl of purple bougainvillea screened me from the street, and a small kerosene lamp lit my work. It was a decidedly romantic setting. My mother was off visiting her pious Catholic friends. My father was dining at the Hotel Russell with business associates. And my grandmother was upstairs in bed, no doubt already half intoxicated on her sherry and reading old Cuban romances. Even the maids had the evening off. "Señorita," a young man mounted the steps. It was the cafetero, the one people called a fool. "I have a message for your father," he said, "from my boss at the coffee roastery." No one else was about. I studied him in the lamplight. His eyes were dark and beautiful, his black hair thick. The muscles of his arms bulged nicely, threaded with thick veins. "Come," I said, "sit here." I patted the cushions next to me on the settee. He hesitated, twisting his cap in his hands. "Oh, I couldn't, miss." "No, really, do," I said. "You must." He sat. I could hear his breath. I embroidered, pulling turquoise floss through the damask again and again in precise and tiny stitches. There was no sound but his breathing and the sliding of the thread. He stared at the fabric, hooped taut, and at my hands, which did have a peculiarly beautiful waxen glow in the lamplight, very pale and very smooth. We both sat there watching my hands' serene and delicate movements, and I wondered if he could even think such words as spellbinding or mesmerizing or exquisite, if he even possessed such a vocabulary. He probably couldn't compliment me properly if he tried. He'd likely manage only beautiful or pretty. How dull it would be, such a courtship, which was why I supposed peasants simply didn't court ladies. Only knights, and even precious few of them, could make up sonnets on the spot. The cafetero said nothing. Paucity of vocabulary aside, he should have at least tried. But he simply sat there. This irritated me. I saw, though, that his hand had dropped to the little expanse of green silk that stretched between our two laps and lay very near my thigh. But it didn't move closer. It didn't dare. He said nothing. I glanced up at his face. He was no longer staring at my exquisite hands with their serene and waxen glow, but at my throat and décolletage, which was, if I remembered correctly, quite prettily arranged and edged with golden lace, though I'd been expecting no particular company. His dark eyes rose to mine, and they were sweet and hungry. I looked down at that hand, brown and rough, against our green silk settee, and my needle moved through the air quite slowly and deliberately. Its sharp steel tip came to rest lightly upon his flesh and then pressed. It pushed in just a little. The cafetero gasped. A red pearl of blood welled. I met his eyes, which were confused and pained and utterly humble, and a strange, delicious heat tugged low in my belly. The air smelled different, an unexpected kind of hot, burnt scent, like winter lightning. My legs shifted inside my skirt. I pulled away my needle. My eyes locked on his, and I lifted his great brown paw and leaned over it. My tongue lapped away the blood. He gasped again. Another, smaller pearl squeezed slowly out and sat there, red on his brown skin. I licked it off. He stared at me with his full lips parted, his eyes still hurt and wondering, as obedient as a hound's. I set his hand on the place in his lap that had been stirring, and he groaned. With men, the best way was to exit quickly and mysteriously, leaving them wanting and confused. So I did. Thank you.